So a little while back, I had a couple of vlogs about how it's kind of weird and difficult to try to classify something by its depth, to try to clarify what it means for something to be deep, how deep something can be. Just in general, it's a weird metric to try to measure things by. But now I want to try to approach this somewhat differently by talking about intelligence in shows, what it means for a show to be smart or to be smartly written. I think that, again, this can be debatable and confusing, but I think that there's a general sense that we all understand that some things are smartly written and some things don't seem to be. Like, that's something that I don't think needs much clarification. We all kind of have this feeling like we see something smart and we know it's smart. Now, what I'm going to do to help break down the different ways that a show can be smart is to make 4 different classifications of what a smart series is. The 4 different categories are as follows: thematic richness, narrative richness, clever writing, and clever construction. These are the 4 different ways that a show or a piece of media can seem intelligent, and I'm going to break down each of these using examples. A great example of a thematically rich story in anime would be Fate Zero. This show does have some clever writing, some interesting presentation, and some intrigue in the narrative, but I think that by far most of the appeal of the show comes from its themes and how every character in the series sort of represents a different kind of ideology, and a lot of the series is about exploring how those different ideologies bounce off of each other. The best episodes are ones wherein, there's a clash of ideology between 2 characters. I think that if you stripped out the themes from Fate Zero, you would be left with an incredibly boring show that is almost totally unappealing. That might just be me speaking personally, but I really think that that's the biggest appeal of the show. An example of something with a lot of narrative richness might be Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Again, FMAB does have some interesting themes, some pretty good presentation, and some fairly clever writing, but really it's watching this enormous narrative with all these different factions and all these different characters as it sort of locks in place, watching all these events play out and how they all feed into this greater overarching narrative, and then watching the enormous payoff of that narrative in the giant fucking climax of the series is the biggest appeal of it. I think that if you had that show with all the same themes and characters without as much of a great central narrative, it wouldn't be nearly as interesting, which is kind of why I don't like the 2003 version of FMA as much. And while that show does have some different themes and different ideas that some people really enjoy, and not everyone hates the narrative, I think that the narrative was a lot more broken in that series, and that's why as it goes along, it kind of gets worse and worse, whereas, in the early episodes where it's really dedicated to its themes is when it's sort of at its strongest. Now, an example of a series that really uses clever writing to its advantage, I would give that to Shirobako. This show does have some pretty well-presented themes, but those themes are pretty simple, and the presentation is really nothing all that special. I mean, the show looks good and is directed well, but it's not really about its presentation, nor is it really about a narrative at all. I mean, the narrative is pretty much a backseat to the character interactions and just the overall writing. It's really about how cleverly the show can present the things that these characters are going through, how real the characters feel, how good their dialogue feels, how all of it speaks to real life in an interesting fashion. And then lastly, a show which is cleverly presented, which I would just go with K-On! This is a show that doesn't really have that strong of a narrative. There is a narrative arc in there, but you kind of have to watch the whole show before you even really get it. The writing is smart, but, the characters are mostly a bunch of dumb high school kids. And it's not really all that thematically deep. It's mostly about how well they can present the idea of these high school kids hanging out in this club, developing this deep friendship with one another and playing off of one another. It's more about the overall experience than it is about, being deep or smart. It's more about, how it feels to experience the entire thing. And that's sort of what brings all of it together and makes it a great show. And it does take an incredible amount of intelligence as a writer to be able to present something like that. So obviously these 4 categories are not completely distinct from one another, nor is there any show which I think is only successful in one area. Any smart show is probably going to be at least decent at all 4 of these things. But I think it's when you start combining them that you get the shows that people really lavish their praise onto. A show like Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex not only can present a pretty interesting narrative and some really clever writing, but also some incredibly deep and well explored themes, all while being presented pretty well. I wouldn't say the presentation is the most noteworthy aspect of that series, but it's certainly there. And so that's why when people talk about smart anime, they gravitate towards Ghost in the Shell so much, because it accomplishes so many of the different categories of ways that a show can be intelligently written. And of course, really the granddaddy of them all, Legend of the Galactic Heroes, the show that everyone gravitates towards when they talk about shows that are amazingly written, does all of these things incredibly well. It has really interesting themes. It has a really deep and involving narrative that spans hundreds of characters and, like, years and years of time. It's got really clever writing. There's tons of one-liners that are, super famous from the series, where characters just say these really interesting, funny, clever things. And also, it's really well presented. Again, this is one where presentation isn't necessarily the most important thing about it, but I have a whole video about how great the audio-visual presentation of the series is, and just the idea of it being 110 episodes. Like, that is such an amazing presentation for a series like this, to be able to take a concept of, like, yeah, it's going to be this giant story about this fucking epic war that's going on for, decades, and then to present that in itself a massive story that goes into every detail. Really genius presentation. So that's why so many people like to say that Legend of the Galactic Heroes is the smartest anime, the most intelligent anime, because it really fulfills every category of intelligence in media. Now, of course, intelligence is not the only reason to watch something. There's plenty of other reasons to like stuff, such as just it being nice and pleasant or pretty or cool or appealing to you on a personal level, even if it's not necessarily that it's deep. Or, sometimes something can explore one theme in a very simplistic way, but if that theme really resonates with you, then you'll really find yourself enjoying it, I wouldn't really classify the movie Ponyo as following any of these things that strongly. Like, while the movie is very well presented, it has, it's beautifully directed, beautifully animated, and it's just goddamn gorgeous to look at. I don't know if I'd say that the presentation is particularly clever. There's no, like, trick being pulled on you. Where, like, in K-On! You have this feeling where the more of it you watch, the more you understand these characters, the more you relate to them. And then you have that moment where it, like, clicks that you realize how well you understand them. And then you look back at the early episodes and you realize how much everything's changed and how the show's led you down this path, and that's a very meaningful moment. Ponyo does not have that. Ponyo is just pleasant to watch the whole way through, and it's one of my favorite movies, which is why I'm using it as an example. I don't really love it for intellectual reasons. I love it for reasons that involve, like, the physical act of watching it. So there's other reasons that people might enjoy something, but I do think it can be helpful to come at talking about a show's intelligence, talking about what smart writing or just what good writing means, by breaking it down into these categories and, really thinking about what the difference is between something being cleverly presented versus thematically rich, and acknowledging all four categories and being able to recognize that a show, can be smart in more than one way. So hopefully that's interesting and helpful for all of you. And maybe I'll talk about this more in the future. Who knows?